Hello, I'm Nana Sajaia, and on behalf of the Center for Russian Studies, welcome to this series of interviews on Russia. Today, I'll be speaking to Nina Jankowicz, who studies Russian disinformation campaigns and its implications internationally. Hi, Nina. Thank you for finding time for this discussion. Today, we will be speaking about your book and Russian disinformation at large. I find this book very thought-provoking. How to lose the information war. So before we dive into details, tell me who's at war here.
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways to think about the information war. Originally, when I first conceived of the book during 2016 and 2017 and all of the revelations about Russian interference in the US elections, I was thinking more Russia versus the West. But as I'm sure we'll talk about today, as I did research in the 5 countries that are profiled in the book, so Georgia, of course, Estonia, Czech Republic, Poland, and Ukraine, it dawned on me actually that there was a domestic war of disinformation in almost every country as well, where authentic local voices were aiding, sometimes wittingly, sometimes unwittingly, the propagation of Russian disinformation. So you could say there are 2 fronts in this war, one that is international and one that is domestic.
Definitely, that is impression of a reader as well, that there are layers of disinformation war. Tell me domestically, why does Russia, why does Kremlin need this information? What is the goal there with its own citizens, with its own constituents?
I think this is something that a lot of people misunderstand and often think, oh, Putin just wants, to influence, he wants power. But actually, these campaigns of asymmetric warfare, as people call it, allow Putin to get more leverage with his population at home in a couple of really important ways. First of all, by using the fissures or grievances in Western societies, like let's say, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, which resulted in, unfortunately, the manhandling of protesters and journalists at protests. We saw that make its way to Russian disinformation and propaganda at home in Russia, saying, oh, you think the United States, this great bastion of democracy, is so wonderful, but look at how they're treating their citizens. So really denigrating Western democracy. That's number one. Number two, when we are so subsumed with all of our domestic problems and worries, which Russia is happily amplifying, the West is paying a lot less attention to what Russia is doing in countries like Georgia, in countries like Ukraine, Syria, Venezuela, the Central African Republic, the list goes on. And then finally, by using this asymmetric warfare and disinformation, Putin is really elevating his status. So we saw just recently, President Biden have a call with Putin about Ukraine, which of course is a laboratory for a lot of disinformation tactics. President Biden also met with Putin in June. President Trump met with him several times, of course. And a lot of the topics of these meetings have been disinformation and the use of election influence. And basically, by spending very little money and investing in these campaigns that kind of are a fly on the wall of American or Western democracy writ large, Putin has saved himself a seat at the global negotiating table, which allows him to shore up popularity at home.
Though forms might be different and new, as you mentioned in your book, propaganda is not a new fruit to the Soviet era or post-Soviet region. And I'm reading quotes from your book. Unlike Soviet propaganda, which sought to promote a specific communist-centric worldview, the Kremlin divides and deceives populations around the world with one goal in mind: the destruction of Western democracy as we know it. Tell me more about this.
So I think there's actually a really good dichotomy in the present day that shows how Soviet propaganda, or let's say Chinese propaganda, is different than what we're seeing in Russian disinformation today. So in the Soviet era, we saw this pushing of the Soviet worldview. You know, the West is bad, the Soviet Union, where all people are equal, where everyone has an equal chance to live a sustainable life. that's a much better system of society. And the West is full of capitalists who want to steal from you and no one has any rights, right? That was the main ethos there. What we see now is very different. So from Russia, we see a lot of competing narratives. In the United States alone, during the 2016 election, we saw Russia supporting far left candidates and ideologies, the Bernie Sanders campaign and folks who supported him, as well as far right candidates and ideologies, not just Donald Trump, but people who were looking for gun rights or Texas secession or things like this. So all of that, that is in conflict with the Soviet kind of worldview, where you would just be promoting one ideology to promote kind of the Soviet Union itself. What China is doing today, where they are trying to promote the CCP, they are trying to push this narrative that coronavirus didn't start in China, or if it did, that the CCP's response was laudable and they didn't do anything wrong. That is a lot more similar to Soviet propaganda of yesteryear than it is to Russian disinformation today, which seeks to polarize people. And that polarization makes people less interested in participating in democracy. It makes them less trusting of institutions and information. And as a result, we can see that sometimes people are going to be less inclined to participate in the democratic process. And when people don't want to participate in voting, in making their voices heard, democracy doesn't work.
So you use the word war, which is a very strong word. And in political science, we know there are different weapons of the war, different instruments when it comes to the war. So what do you think is the equation of disinformation in the Russian arsenal? How serious of a weapon is it in international relations for Kremlin?
Well, I think the Kremlin understands that getting into a military conflict with the EU or with NATO or with the United States, or even to some degree with Ukraine at this point, which has really strengthened its defenses over the past 8 years, would be inadvisable. And so the Kremlin seeks to destabilize through informational means. And I think they see information and influence, especially through the internet, which really democratizes influence and information flows. I think they see that as a weapon, and a very potent weapon, one that doesn't cost them a lot, but can create a lot of havoc on their behalf and really destabilize certain countries that are target societies in order to get a desired outcome. Again, whether that outcome is just distracting the nation, whether it is achieving some sort of specific political goal in that nation, or just generally polarizing the nation. I think the Kremlin recognizes that. And unfortunately, the costs that the West have instilled or enacted on the Kremlin haven't really been enough to dissuade the Kremlin from stopping these campaigns. Yes, we have had expulsions and sanctions, but we still see these continued efforts of online influence campaigns to this day. And I think we need to start thinking a little bit more creatively about how we push back against those campaigns.
And that brings me to my next question. You say how to lose the information war. Do you imply we as the West or as the free world are losing the war against Russian disinformation?
I think as it stands right now, we definitely are still losing the information war, unfortunately. And one of the reasons I really wanted to write this book is that I think the post-Soviet and post-communist region is very clear-eyed about the threat that Russian disinformation poses, and has been on the front lines of this conflict for so long. Countries like Georgia and Ukraine and Estonia have tried a lot of the best practices and know what works to some degree and what doesn't. And yet we in the West were arguing for years about whether Russia was engaging in disinformation campaigns at all. And we lost a lot of time while we were doing that. So that was my first intention with the book, to really kind of hit everyone on the head and say, this has been happening for a long time. We are not the first that this has happened to, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And we should look to our allies in Central and Eastern Europe to learn from them. Unfortunately, we've still done very little of that. And I think there are some glimmers of hope among the examples that I give in the book. Estonia has invested a lot in education. Ukraine is learning how to tell a better story. Georgia has a lot of creative programs, both within the government and in civil society, that are being somewhat kind of neutralized by some of the current administration's activities, but still there's a lot of knowledge there. So I think, we're making strides, we're learning what works. And I hope that with a new administration here in the United States, one that ostensibly cares about the truth, we should start to really put one foot in front of the other and create a holistic program about responding to disinformation. And some Western countries have gotten a little bit better at this. The UK in particular is quite good, but I'm hoping that we'll see a more holistic effort across the board from Western nations, and that we'll be learning from our allies in Central and Eastern Europe when we do.
So as you describe it in your book, 2007, Estonia was the first big case where we saw Kremlin using other forces than, conventional military forces, and starts with cyber attacks, then follows Georgia, and of course, Ukraine and many other countries in the region. But as you have also discussed previously, studying Russian and studying Russia was not that popular here in the United States. And you said in one of your interviews that 2016 was the time when people started kind of paying some attention to Russia. Tell me, from your knowledge and experience as somebody who has also worked in Eastern European countries and who studies Russia from the United States, has it been an awakening moment or not enough?
I think we have seen some degree of a wake-up call. Unfortunately, what has prevented kind of a full-fledged reinvestment in Russian studies and Russian language and kind of regional studies writ large is the politicization of the topic of Russian interference. Because for 4 years, if you mentioned Russia, certain populations in the United States would laugh you out of the room, and certain populations would think that, this is a very serious topic that we need to discuss. Now, I think we're seeing a little bit more of a clear-eyed approach to Russia on Capitol Hill. We're seeing Republicans, talking about Nord Stream 2, talking about malign Kremlin influence, and I'm happy to see that. I do worry that we have wasted a lot of time in kind of that political rancor. This should not be a partisan issue. No American, Democrat, Republican, or anywhere in between should want a foreign country meddling in our elections and duping American citizens into believing nonsense on the internet, right? No one should want that. But unfortunately, I think that's what we've seen. And as a result, we haven't seen the necessary investment in civil society programming, in Russian studies, in Russian expertise, in the government writ large. And I hope that now that we're almost a year into the Biden administration, we're going to start to see that soon. And at the Summit for Democracy, some of the promises that came out from that summit most recently were really big investments in things like independent media, civil society programming, democracy support, et cetera, which I think a lot will be channeled to the kind of democratic backsliding that we're seeing in some countries in Central and Eastern Europe.
So in your book, you also discuss the different efforts the countries made, the countries discussed in your book, like Georgia, Ukraine, Czechia, then Czech Republic, Estonia. You speak about some specific efforts that were more or less effective, some campaigns more successful than others, but you also speak a great deal about the lack of united front. Tell me, who do you think shall lead that united front, and what is it supposed to do?
Well, I think we have seen a vacuum of American leadership when it comes to dealing with Russia, but also dealing with the infodemic, as we've taken to call it, during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think the United States used to serve as a real convener in the international community, particularly in the democratic space. And during the Trump years, we saw that, the United States was not really a player in democracy support anymore. In fact, we saw the Trump administration attempt to zero out many of the programs that have brought such fruitful work and fruitful really changes to so many of the countries in the region. And so ideally, as an American, I would love to see the United States back in that spot again, but we have work to do on our own ground before I think we can be credible in that way.
And there are some local and fewer international disinformation debunking efforts. But if we take a look at a large image, are they counterproductive?
They can be counterproductive, certainly. I think we see sometimes efforts that draw more attention to falsehoods than they really deserve. They'll often amplify the lies that we see coming from Russia that might not have gotten a lot of traction otherwise. That being said, they are helpful in keeping track of the certain narratives that we see coming, the changes in those narratives, the tools and tactics that adversaries are using. But I do think that we need to stop thinking of fact-checking and debunking initiatives as a panacea. They're not going to solve everything. I say in the book, and I've said in many interviews, we're not going to fact check ourselves out of the crisis of truth and trust that we're in right now. Our citizens are craving something, and many of the pieces of disinformation that they encounter online are grounded in a kernel of truth somewhere, whether that's an emotional truth, a worry that they're not going to get a job after the COVID crisis, or that they're going to face economic hardship, or that their elected officials aren't hearing their grievances. And something about that disinformation that they encounter speaks to them. So we really need to look at addressing those vulnerabilities and that resiliency. How do we build that resiliency for people to say, okay, I'm facing some economic hardship right now, but that doesn't mean that there is a cabal of Satan worshiping pedophiles in the Oval Office, right? That sort of thing is really important. It is much harder to achieve. It's a generational investment that we need to make, but I am hoping that we start to make those investments soon, because unlike the fact-checking initiatives, what I did see in the research for my book is that those initiatives which focused on education, which focused on the real issues that drove people to disinformation in the first place, were the most successful initiatives that I encountered.
Yeah, there is disinformation as a tool, and there is entire political climate in which it thrives, right? Tell me, what do you think about the Cold War era initiatives such as Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty? They've played their role in history, and not to diminish it, but how effective are they today?
I think they have been underfunded for a long time, but if we look at the type of thing that Russia is putting out there with RT, or even if we look at the democratic equivalents of Voice of America and RFERL, let's say the BBC, Deutsche Welle, or AFP, those are, really substantial newsrooms, and there are great journalists at VOA and RFERL. I think they need more resources to be able to reach audiences in new ways and bring that reporting in a flashy, exciting infotainment style to the audiences that need them. I know personally that even though I speak Russian, Ukrainian, and Polish, when I am in the region, and really focusing on developing and breaking events in that region, I will go to the local RFE or VOA reporters first, because I think they're trustworthy sources of information, they're good reporters, and they're not influenced by local oligarchs or the local public broadcaster. So I think they do have a role, but I think we need to empower those agencies more to connect with audiences that they're having difficulty reaching right now.
In terms of political landscapes and structures of democracies, or the lack thereof, tell me what hinders the process of countering propaganda?
The biggest thing that hinders the process of countering propaganda or disinformation is when governments use it themselves, because we can't wag our finger at Russia, China, or Iran and say, no, no, you can't use disinformation on us, when our own governments are using it on us. So Poland is a great example of that. Poland has no love lost with Russia. They recognize Russian disinformation. Many Poles consider themselves inoculated to Russian disinformation, just like many Georgians probably do as well. But we see the law and justice government in Poland using troll factories, using astroturfing, using disinformation, taking over the public broadcaster so that there is no legitimate criticism allowed to stand in the Polish discourse about politics and the government. And as a result, we see Russia latching on to those disinformation narratives that the Polish government is producing themselves. So that is a very, very dangerous situation. And it is one that makes us all rife for outside manipulation, no matter which country it's coming from. And I think we all need to look ourselves in the eye and recognize that as elected officials, as policymakers, there is a duty to tell the truth, because democracy doesn't work without the truth.
And whatever happens in Russia does not really stay in Russia. It has its implications in immediate neighborhood, but beyond that too, even here in the United States, Russia has become a news topic almost on a daily basis. Tell me how Russian voters, Russian citizens are responding to Russian disinformation, how susceptible they are of it.
Well, I think domestically, even before Russia started testing out its campaigns in places like Estonia, Georgia, and Ukraine, it was testing them on Russian citizens. And unfortunately, though there are extraordinarily smart individuals in Russia, the media landscape has been almost completely obliterated. And what we see now is just a situation where it's almost completely state media or oligarch-owned media, and the few independent outlets that exist have very little kind of coverage of the local population, and opposition figures like Alexei Navalny are being poisoned. We saw some response to that, but not enough, unfortunately, to really unsettle Putin and the regime in the Kremlin. I do think, though, that we see some response and some kind of reflection in Russia sometimes from its own disinformation campaigns. A good example of this, of course, is the anti-COVID vaccination disinformation campaign, which has, I believe, led to a very low vaccination uptake rate in Russia. Many people don't trust the Sputnik vaccine, don't want to take any other vaccines, or if they do want to take a vaccine, they're only going to take Western vaccines, and those aren't as available in Russia. So now Russia has a serious COVID problem because of its own disinformation, which has kind of boomeranged back into Russia. But when you talk about other disinformation, I think Russians tend to have a little bit of a whataboutist approach to disinformation. They say, well, the United States meddles in our affairs as well. All governments lie, all governments spy. And I think that's categorically just a totally different viewpoint, and one that the Kremlin has fed Russian citizens for a very long time, that, the presence of Voice of America or RFERL reporters in Moscow is the same as people from the Internet Research Agency attempting to masquerade as Americans in order to get people to behave differently in an election. All of that's very, very different. So I think there are some instances where Russians are savvy, and some, unfortunately, where state propaganda has won the day.
Your book, as fascinating as it is, it also portrays pretty grim picture. Are you pessimistic?
This is a hard question to answer. It would be very hard to do my work without a little bit of optimism. But I have to say, in the past year, especially since January 6th here in Washington, it is hard to find cause for optimism when I'm thinking about disinformation and the Western response to it, because so much of what we have seen, what caused and fueled the insurrection in the Capitol was disinformation, and has only become more entrenched in our society, in our political discourse over the past year. So to make me feel a little bit more optimistic, I would need to see more coordination internationally. with some clear commitments from certain nations that not only are we going to avoid the use of political disinformation domestically, but we're going to hold our partner nations to account. We're looking at, Kaczynski and Orban in particular when we say things like that. But also, that we need domestically for each country to take on this very important responsibility themselves, right? We need to understand that this isn't something that, the United States or the UK or Canada or whomever else, the Swedes, can run to our defense at, because these campaigns are by their very nature extremely targeted and nuanced and changed for each country. Yes, the goals are the same, but the individual lines of attack, those narratives are going to be different for every country, and the people most well equipped to deal with them are at home. So we each need to take this responsibility on and create holistic whole of government programs to fight this stuff, looking at our own vulnerabilities at home, not just playing whack-a-troll online, not just sanctioning our adversaries, but trying to solve the problems of governance that allow adversaries like Russia to manipulate us. As well as working together to solve those problems. It's a big lift. It's not something that's going to change overnight. But I'm hoping that if we continue to beat this drum, if we continue to see really devastating events that are caused by disinformation, that soon we're going to wake up. I have to believe that, or I wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning.
Nina, thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. And I hope we'll keep in touch sooner in person than later.
Absolutely. Me too. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.